That being said, best place to start is the beginning. As was said, my name is Mike Redman. I've been doing IT and cybersecurity for about 14 years or so, but the majority of it in cybersecurity. Started as a network engineer. I have a master's degree in cybersecurity and a bachelor's in network engineering. So security just kind of took over as I was in the beginning of my career designing networks and things like that. Some of the certifications I hold: CISSP, CISM, CCNA. Certified ethical hacker, and there's more, but I guess you kind of get the idea with those. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, when we start talking about how to measure your organization's cybersecurity risk, there are lots of things to consider. And a lot of, and as I was trying to put this together for this afternoon, I had to pare a lot of it out because there are just so many factors to consider when you're deciding to identify an organization's risk appetite. So I kind of just took the highlights of kind of a bunch of different sections, just so you can get an idea of kind of the depth and breadth of how risk should be managed and should be identified, and most definitely should be measured within the organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about why do you need to make sure that you are measuring risk, both quantifiably and qualifiably, how to choose some of your cybersecurity metrics. What are the critical factors when it comes to choosing those metrics? How to take, once you have decided on those metrics, how to take that raw data and formulate it into something that can be qualified and quantified to show to the stakeholders. And I put together a little example of a method that I use in all of my organizations, including the one that I work for now, called the CVSS scorecard, and it measures, it's specifically designed to measure software, firmware, hardware type risk, but it can be modified, a little bit. We'll talk about when we get there on how to measure things that are very non-technical or non-physical. Okay, so when it comes down to why do I need to quantify and qualify my risk, well, it all really comes down to our job as cybersecurity professionals are to be able to communicate to the business stakeholders, to the C-level executives, what their true risk is. That's what they rely on us for. When I teach CISSP classes and CISM classes, the very first day, kind of the very first hour, right? I set the table for the candidates at that time, kind of, explaining what it is, that we at this level need to do and need to keep in mind. And at the end of the day, we are there to provide best counsel to the senior leaders, right? To whether they be C-level executives, flag officers, vice presidents. That's what our job is to provide best counsel. And how we do that can be, depending on, of course, the size of the organization and other factors, somewhat complicated. But it really all does boil down to two simple things. When you start wanting to measure and identify risk, what you're simply looking for is uncertainty and exposure, right? So uncertainty, we need to figure out if the thing, right, whatever the risk we're trying to identify is true or false. Is it a real risk? Is it a perceived risk? Once we narrow into whether it's real or perceived, then we go to step two and determine what the organization's exposure to that risk is, as well as what is our exposure to the unknown unknowns, right? So working through kind of that mental exercise ultimately gives you what your true risk is, right? So you've probably seen this, quasi, equation, floating around the internet here and there. It's been used, for as long as I can remember, right? Vulnerability times threat times asset value times probability equals risk. And that really is all we're doing when we're qualifying and quantifying risk for ourselves. So how do we decide what we are going to use as measuring sticks? What is going to show us as an organization what our true risk is? Well, it comes down to choosing the right metric. Oftentimes we as cybersecurity professionals have a tendency to use data because it's there. It's there, it's readily available, but we've chosen the wrong metric because it's not really telling us anything. And since it's not really telling us anything, it's not very valuable to the organization. So what we what we indicate, right, when we're looking at how to choose the correct metric, we're looking for SMART metrics. And SMART simply stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So those are the decision points or the data points that you're looking for when you're looking at which metric is going to suit me best. So we can break down into each one of those. However, it really is kind of, they are as they seem. I want to choose a metric or a data point that's very specific. So how many threats were reported? How many incidents were reported in this time frame, in this specific time frame? Can I measure that? Well, obviously I can if I can measure, if I can quantify it, right? A number value of how many I dealt with. Are my metric achievable? So once I identify a baseline, how many incidents were reported? Well, what do I want to do with that? Do I want to see that number come down or go up, right? And I set the goal, right? The key goals for, okay, so this is how many we had in Q1. We want to try to increase the number of incidents reported by 10% in Q2. Right? So that is what's meant, right, by achievable. Relevant and time-bound, well, obviously relevant. Why do I care how many incidents were reported? One of the things, just as an example, that reported incidents tell you as a security manager or a cybersecurity director is how well your incident response plan and procedures are working. If you get very few reported incidents, that generally means your users don't know how to identify an incident. So I want to see my reported incidents go up, right? Not necessarily that I want to see incidents go up. I want to see the reported incidents go up. And then time-bound, kind of is as it states, right? You want to measure in finite time. I want to measure either in quarters, months, years, so I can compare apples to apples, year to year or quarter to quarter, so I can get a true value, quantified value, a number value of whatever it is that data point that I'm trying to read. Some of the other critical factors when it comes to deciding what measurements you're going to use, quantifiable information, numbers, right? What percentage of, how many of, what's the dollar value of, I need quantifiable information. As we stated, the data points should be readily available. You shouldn't have to buy a new tool to extract data. It should already be there in the tool sets that you have. right? So it comes down to trying to reduce the overall cost of security in an organization. If I have to buy a new tool to measure a data point, I probably have selected the wrong data point to try to measure. My infrastructure or my program isn't matured to the point that I already have the tools to do that measurement. And so that's what we try to indicate, right? When we say, okay, we want to make sure that these measures are readily available to us. Repeatable, right? So whenever you put something under any type of test, the test must be valid. And the only way for a test or an examination to be valid is I have to be able to do the exact same thing over and over again and expecting a result, right? Now, don't confuse it with Einstein's theory of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. It's a little twist on it, right? For me to be able to examine something, the procedures I use to examine it must be the same every time so I can get a consistent, repeatable result out of it. If I start to vary, I will get inconsistent results. And now the data that I'm at that point collecting ultimately is going to be useless, right? And that brings you to the last critical factor, that data, whatever the measurement that you're using, it must be useful to the organization. Again, don't select data just for data's sake, right? One of the favorite sons that I have a tendency to pick on in classes are scans. Organizations love to do scans. And they do a lot of them over and over and over and over again. And they bring back these numbers that are truly useless to you because they're not grounded in truth for anyone, right? If I run a Nessus scan and the Nessus scan comes back and says that I have 500 patches missing across my infrastructure, well, that number doesn't tell me anything, right? It tells me I'm missing patches on a number of systems, but how many systems and what do those systems do, right? That's something the scanner can't tell you. The scanner is going to tell you, we scanned 500 systems, and of those 500 systems, we found 500 missing patches. Well, that could have just been one missing patch per system, which would tell me, oh, well, I'm doing pretty good. I'm at 99.5% on my patch levels. Or it could be a pocket of 100 systems that these 500 missing patches were found. But why were they in that pocket of systems? What is possibly special about those systems as to why we didn't put a particular patch or sets of patches on it? And so if I begin to react on just this raw data, I can do more harm than I'm actually doing good by patching the machine because I chose the wrong metric to tell me the story. Okay. I hope that makes sense to you. If it ever doesn't, feel free to drop a question in the chat box, and I'll clean it up for you as best I can. So this is kind of more of the same, and I just wanted to give you as many words as I could to kind of tell you the same story, because choosing the right metric is how the program survives, right? I'm actually in the middle of setting up a brand new cybersecurity program for an organization that never really had a cybersecurity program. Educate them as the program builds. Part of the education right? And sometimes in a very selfish way, part of me showing, how am I earning my check every day is by selecting the right metric for either the IT department or the executive management or the vice presidents or what have you, for them to watch for trends as to whether or not the program is doing well or doing as expected at a point in time. Right. But if I start selecting improper metric or metrics that are not useful, it can guide you to different trend points that will start, well, it's what I generally say, it'll start lying to you, right? You'll start chasing ghosts because the metric is not accurate for what you think you're looking at it for. And we'll go into that just a little later. Some of the things that you might want to consider as far as which are good metric to select or better metrics to select, things like your level of preparedness, right? Are your what have you decided is your patch level? Ground it in a number. We want to be at 95% of all systems patched over 1 month or over 3 months or whatever is your organization. That is a good kind of yardstick to identify, okay, how well is our patch management program working? Are we able to patch the systems in a timely manner the way we want to? And then, if you fall short, then okay, so let's go look at why did we fall short within our patch management program. Unidentified devices on your internal network or on your network in general. This is especially important and becoming more and more important in today's world, where more and more organizations have moved to BYOD. People, bringing their own mobile devices, phones, tablets, laptops, into the organization and connecting to the network or attempting to connect to the network. You should have an IDS device or an IPS device on your network that should be alerting you to devices that are attempting to connect or have connected to your protected infrastructure, whether that be your internal network, maybe you have an extranet, or maybe it's unknown devices connecting in the DMZ, right? So, but that is a good metric to be able to identify what is your basic cyber hygiene health within the organization. Are we identifying possible attack vectors with these unknown devices? Intrusion attempts. So I kind of touched on that a little earlier with how many reported incidents do we have. So with intrusion attempts, how many attacks did our firewall identify versus how many attacks did our firewall neutralize? And that is a number that is not always going to be 100%, right? There are going to be things, believe it or not, there's going to be things that your firewall will identify the attack, but it won't be able to prevent the attack, either because maybe the firewall has a bad ACL on it, or maybe it identified it or misidentified the attack, so the attack became successful. And those are those are the numbers that you want to be able to track. How many times was our boundary knocked on, right? How many people were knocking on the door versus how many intrusions were successful? And then you now take those successful intrusions, right, and compare them to, for instance, your reported incidents, and then you can start to see where you have some cause and correlation beginning to happen. But if I'm not collecting the metric, I'll never be able to find it, right? And these are things that happen so frequently that going back after the fact, right, going back and doing the forensics on the firewall logs and things like that, it's very time consuming versus having a tuned sim in place that is going to be collecting all these logs, correlating them for you, and sending you alerts for things that you find important. Mean time to detect, right, kind of goes along, the same lines, right? Malware has landed on a system. How long did it take us to detect the malware was there? Did the IDS immediately alert us, or was it more of an APT that sat there dormant for a month before we were able to catch it? Right? How long did it take for us to actually detect that something has gotten in, and then couple it with a metric of what is the mean time to resolve? So once we identify it, once we detect it, how long does it take us to resolve the issue? Now, these two metrics can be used in concert with each other for many things, right? You just put a twist on it for what you need the twist for. For instance, like a help desk, right, you may want to capture number of tickets opened versus number of tickets closed, mean time to close the ticket, and put those three individual metric together, and it will tell you a story, right? If I have, and let's just try an example. Let's see if I can pull one off the top of my head. Let's say I have, over the course of 3 months, I have 500 tickets open and opened. And also over the course of 3 months, I have 400 tickets closed. So I have a delta of 100 tickets that have not been closed for whatever reason, of the 500 that were opened in that 3-month span. And then I go look at what is my mean time to close a ticket. And that could tell me the story that I'm looking for. Well, it's taking my help desk personnel an average of 6 hours to close each ticket. I only have X amount of help desk personnel, hence they don't have the time to get to the volume of tickets that are coming in. Maybe I need to hire another help desk person, right? So that's how you stack those metrics together to make it make sense to you. And that's how you communicate up into the executive level. And, whenever you want to go, hire someone, the first time any of my staff say, we need more help, right? We need to hire someone. The first thing that I ask, and the first thing that I'm always asked when I tell my bosses that we need to go hire, some people is, what's not getting done. And if I can't show them what's not getting done, I don't have any quantified or qualified evidence to show them, here's what's not getting done, and the numbers are telling us that, right? So that's how you can kind of stack those, some of those metrics together to get a clearer picture of really what you're hunting for. Average days to patch, that is, a kind of I would say it's almost a must, right? You want to know how well your patch management program is working. So you should always be tracking how long does it take from the time a patch is released to the time that it takes us to test the patch, to the time it takes us to deploy the patch, to the percentage of devices on the infrastructure that require the patch, right? And at which point do I declare victory, right? Do I declare victory at the time it took for the patch to be released, to the time we recognize it was released? That probably is not going to be a good measurement for you, simply because you haven't done anything yet, right? Really. However, if you notice, right, that you're missing a lot of patches, right? Patches were released 6 months ago, and for whatever reason, they haven't even been acknowledged or deployed yet. Well, that may be a metric you now want to begin to capture to try to figure out what is it that we're missing as to why patches are being released by vendors and it's taking us 4 months to even acknowledge the patch exists. And then however amount of time it takes to test the patch and deploy the patch. So that's why I say I can't give you an absolutes with this, right? And nor is it just days to patch, right? Because there are sub functions within days to patch that you'll need to define for yourself and for what what looks like in what right looks like in your organization. Cybersecurity awareness training. So cybersecurity awareness is one of those things that is getting, I'm going to say, more attention. Whether or not it's the right attention or not, we can leave open for debate. But it is getting more attention to the point that people realized for a very long time that your annual cybersecurity awareness training was nothing more than a paperwork drill where you looked at the PowerPoint. Some people didn't even look at the PowerPoint. They just go to the last slide of the PowerPoint where the certificate is, you sign it, send it back to the security manager. Where now it is starting to be realized, recognized, and required that not only are you providing cybersecurity awareness training, but some measure of understanding that what you provided in your training was understood by the end user, right? And that can be done in a variety of ways, right? It can be done either through direct testing, right? Here, look at this PowerPoint. Here are some questions to answer. Or at smaller kind of, at the, unit level, if you will, where you have, kind of unit directors or branch directors, whatever you might call them, do randomized sit downs with people in their organization. Typically, I try to install a method of both, right? Where I want each business unit to sit down over once every quarter and have a sit down with their people and talk about some aspect of cybersecurity awareness. They can choose it, or they can have me choose it for them, and then report how well their people, A, participated, second, understood the concepts that you were trying to get across. It's not good enough anymore to just provide the training. You have to make sure that the training was received and understood, right? We talked about number of cybersecurity incidents reported. Again, this is going to be wide and varied, depending on the maturity level of your organization. How mature your cybersecurity program is going to directly correlate to how well your organization recognizes what an incident is, which means you have to do some heavy lifting up front. You have to first define for them, what is a reportable incident, and do it in such a way that you capture their attention, and that can be very difficult, especially when dealing with policy and standards and procedures. People have a tendency to use way too many words to get their point across, and users don't want to read a novel just to figure out what a reportable incident is. So figuring out what's right for your organization to define what a reportable incident is versus just an incident, right? You have to give them something to compare it to, and then test them over time, right? Making sure that they understand what a reportable incident is. use, for instance, in my case, like I said, I'm building a cybersecurity program from the ground up, which is generally, with a well-received organization, it's about a 3 or 4 year effort just to get it to the point where the program is working. So the first year and a half, even though I've defined for them, for instance, what an incident is, they still don't necessarily understand what a reportable incident is because of how they always did business prior to, right? So I spend a lot of time, all my days within this organization in meetings and teaching, right? When this happens, this is something that we want to know about, right? This is something that causes a problem for us. We want you to report that, right? So I use incidents currently as teaching opportunities, less than someone getting in trouble for not reporting something, right? Because they just don't know what they don't know yet. Now, 3 years down the road, after we've had time to let the program kind of bake in, then, right, we'll start collecting a different metric, not only about incidents reported, but how accurate the report was. Did they capture the information that we asked them to capture prior to IT getting there? Did they do the right actions, right? Did they turn off the computer or did they unplug the computer from the network? Were they there at the computer when the IT person arrived to help and triage it, or did they leave the computer unattended, right? So we're not to that point yet in the program, but over time, that will be a metric that we add when we're trying to identify how well our incident response plans and procedures are actually being understood. So all of this and all these different metric points, where do I get them? Why do I need this? Should I use that? What do I do with this? At the end of the day, they're numbers, right? They're all quantified numbers. Now, I don't give very many absolutes, but I'm going to give you 2 basic absolutes. You cannot have a reliable assessment that is purely quantitative in nature, right? So that's your first absolute. You cannot have a reliable assessment that is purely quantitative in nature. Your second absolute is you cannot have a reliable assessment that is purely qualitative in nature. So we spend a lot of time discussing quantitative numbers. So now we'll spend a little bit of time with qualitative. All qualitative is, it's how you feel. It's a warm fuzzy. It's what I think. It's not grounded in anyone's reality but mine. This is where you get these words like likelihood and probabilities. What is the likelihood of something happening? Well, if I've worked in an organization prior, that this happened all the time, I would adjudicate that the likelihood is high, versus another person coming from a different organization where this particular whatever we're talking about didn't happen very often. They would indicate that the probability is low. So it's purely subjective based on who is viewing the problem set, right? So that's all qualitative data is. But I need it because without the qualitative data and the quantitative data, I can't ground the total data set into truth, right? So if I went around the room and said, okay, so John, you're a 2, Jack, you're a 3, Mike, you're a 5, Jason, you're a 9, Andrea, you're a 10. Nobody would know what those numbers mean. They would just know that they were assigned some random or seemingly random number. that is what it's like to have a purely quantitative analysis. So I have to ground it in something. I have to ground it in some universal truth that they can then lay over top the numbers that I gave them. So on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being the best, 10 being the worst, Jason, you're a 5. Jack, you're a 10. Andrea, you're a 1, right? So now they have something to ground the truth into. And so that's what we mean by say you have to have, for a good assessment, for good, to be able to truly adjudicate what is real, you have to have both quantified and qualified data and lay them on top of each other. So what I want to do is I want to show you quickly one of the methods that that I use in all of my organizations. I've used it for several years now, that allows me to tell a story to senior leaders on what their true risk is. Right now, again, this is all based, the CVSS scoring is primarily designed for software, hardware, firmware type risk assessments, right? However, like I said, you can tweak it a little bit, right? And you can adjudicate other factors. But in the interest of time, we're just going to go kind of with straight how the calculator works. So you can walk away, and if you want to try it on your own, in your own organization, you have an understanding of how to do it. So basically, the CVSS scoring is it's comprised of 3 metric groups: a base group, a temporal group, and an environmental group. You're going to get a score on a single thing, right? And with the CVSS scoring, what they're doing is they're adjudicating what we call CVEs, or common vulnerability. Oh my gosh, I forgot the E. It'll come to me. We're a single CVE for a particular piece of software, right? And what you need to do is you need to get a base score first. What is the base score, the base vulnerability score for this vulnerability that has been identified? And then you lay on top of that your next scoring group, right? So you'll start with one scoring group, which is your base group. You'll lay the next scoring group on top of it, which will give you a different base score, and then you'll lay your last scoring group on top of that, and it'll give you your final score, right? Now, the calculator does make some assumptions, and the core assumption that it makes is that it assumes that the reasonable worst case impact is true, okay? So it's only going to deal with this is the worst, this is the worst case of this being exploited. So I have an example for you, which kind of makes all of this make a little more sense. So we'll walk through it quickly. Hopefully you understand. So I just picked a CVE at random, right? And this one just happened to be Adobe Acrobat buffer overflow vulnerability. It was identified in 2009. That's how you can tell by the CVE number, CVE 2009-0658. All the CVE numbers move incrementally, and they switch over at the year boundary. So this was the 658th vulnerability identified in 2009, right? So that's what that number means. So the base vulnerability was that Adobe Acrobat and Reader version 9.0 and earlier are vulnerable to buffer overflow caused by improper bounds checking when parsing a malformed JPEG-2 image stream embedded within a PDF document. The attack is that the vulnerability can be exploited by convincing a victim to open a malicious document on a system that uses a vulnerable version of Adobe Acrobat or Adobe Reader. So send them a PDF, with this malformed JBig2 image, now I have set the conditions for the buffer overflow. Okay, that's essentially all that means. So first thing I do is I get my base CVSS score, and it looks something like this, right? And what you see highlighted in green are what the CVSS base starts with. So what is the attack vector? It's a local attack. It's going to cause a buffer overflow on a single machine. What is the attack complexity? It's a fairly low complexity. Anyone can embed an image into a PDF. Are there any privileges required? No. All it requires is for someone to just open it on a system. Is user interaction required? Yes, I got to get them to open this PDF. What is the scope? In other words, do you have to change levels of privilege within the system architecture? And this one happened. It was unchanged, right? Confidentiality. What is the attack, right? So it's a attack on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, all adjudicated as high. Okay, great. So this is my base score. You see my base score is 7.8. It's a 10-point scale. So this is probably something that I want to make sure I've patched my Adobe readers or my Adobe pros out there, because that's a pretty high vulnerability. However, now I need to lay my temporal score on top of that. So what is my temporal score? My temporal score basically is it real? Is this a real issue that we have to deal with? And you see, and the ones in green are the ones that I selected. These are selectable by you. So what is the exploit code maturity? You see I have options here: unproven, proof of concept, functional, and high. All those mean are this vulnerability, like for instance, unproven. This vulnerability exists. We know it exists. However, we have not been able to recreate it in laboratory settings. Versus proof of concept. The vulnerability exists, we know it exists, and we're able to recreate it in laboratory conditions, but we're not seeing it in the wild. Functional. We're able to recreate it in laboratory conditions, and we are seeing it exploited in the wild. And then high, we are seeing it exploited in the wild, and it is being exploited at a high rate. How hard is it to fix? Well, there's an official fix for it. In other words, they have a patch for it. Or they may not have a patch for it, but the vendor has sent out either workaround information or temporary fix information, like disabling the ability to open a PDF with embedded JPEG or whatever. Or is it a 0-day? Is there no remediation available for it at all? And then report confidence, unknown, reasonable, confirmed. Well, again, depending on what you selected ahead of it, well, it kind of will force you into what to select there. So you see, once I lay my temporal score on top of it, it brought my score down to a 7.2, right? Based on the selections that I made. If I would have made different selections, the score would have gone up or down, depending. But now you see I went from a 7.8 to a 7.2. So I'm getting better. It's bringing the risk down. So lastly, I laid my environmental score on top of it. What is my environment? So my environment, based on how my environment works, remember the base scoring was assuming that I had a requirement in my organization for confidentiality, integrity, and availability to all be high. Well, maybe I want or have, assigned within my organization that my confidentiality, integrity, and availability are actually only adjudicated at medium, right? So I want all of them at medium. Since the attack vector required it to be local, well, okay, so now we know, right? I mean, I have ways to limit the danger. if I can change it from, okay, needing local access to maybe you need physical access to the machine to actually exploit it, right? And then you kind of see the, kind of the rest of them and how they move, right? Generally, how you select one will kind of dictate how you're gonna select others. But you see with what I selected here, based on my own environment, it brought my overall score, my adjudicated risk for this particular vulnerability down to a 6.8. So now it's at a moderate, right? So I went from a high risk vulnerability to a moderate risk vulnerability just by applying logic and adjudicating based on my environment and not just what some website or some machine told me was true, right? So that is the CVSS scoring. That's how it's used. If you're looking for a way to actually get a good grounded score and what your perceived risk is versus what your actual risk is, this is an outstanding way to be able to gather that kind of data. Okay.